Okay, today, children, we're going to find out what happens when Carrie gives Mr. Evans the message that she received from Mrs. Gotobed. It doesn't go to plan, and there's a lot of people getting angry. Mrs. Gotobed died one hot day in July. Albert came to the shop in the late afternoon with a letter for Mr. Evans from Hepzibah. He said, "It happened this morning, but there was no one to send till I came home from school." Mr. Evans stood behind the counter and read the letter, and Albert and Carrie watched him. He folded it neatly and put it back in its envelope and stared into space for a minute. Then he went to the front of the shop and pulled down the blinds. "Respect for the dead," he said, speaking to Carrie quite angrily, as if she'd questioned this action, and went to the kitchen to tell Auntie Lou. Carrie and Albert went up the mountain. Neither of them spoke as they climbed. Still without speaking, they sat on a hump of cropped grass, backs against a dry stone wall, the evening sun in their eyes. Carrie thought of all the people she knew in the world, all of them still eating and breathing and walking about, and then of Mrs. Gotobed lying still. Sweat stood cold on her forehead. She said, "She's the first person I've ever known die in my life." "She won't be the last, so you might as well get used to it," Albert said, rather cruelly, it seemed. "Do you have to speak like that?" Carrie said. "In that tone?" "No, but it was the way you spoke. This is the first sorrow of my life, poor little me." "I didn't mean that." "Didn't you?" "No, I didn't." He paused and looked shyly at Carrie. "Sorry if I was beastly." "It's all right." "No, it isn't. I was upset and taking it out on you. That's a rotten trick." "It doesn't matter." "Yes, it does." They looked at each other and grinned. Carrie said, did it hurt her much, dying?" Hepzibah said it was just like putting a light out at the end of a day. "Oh," Carrie said. Then, "What'll happen to Hepzibah? Will she have to leave Druid's Bottom? She's just a servant. She can't stay there, can she? Where will she go? And what'll happen to Mr. Johnny? Oh, Albert!" "Hang on, Tragedy Queen," he said. "It's all right. At least I suppose it will be, because Mrs. Gotobed told me. She said it would be a sin if they were turned out when she died, with Mr. Johnny the way he is, and after Hepzibah had cared for her so well all these years. She said she was going to make a will, saying they could both stay on without paying rent, as long as they wanted to. She couldn't leave them any money, because all she had was an annuity that would come to an end when she died. But Mr. Johnny's got a little bit that his parents left him, and Hepzibah makes some from the poultry, so they should have just enough. Mrs. Gotobed had worked it all out. She said she had no close relations to bother about on her husband's side, and only the Evanses on hers. I think she's left her bits of jewellery to your Auntie Lou. There's not as much as you'd think, mostly glittery junk, paste copies of real stones, and the house to Mr. Evans, though it won't be much use to him. He can't sell it or let it, of course, while Hepzibah's living there." He pulled a face. "I expect he'll be flaming mad when he knows that, won't he? I expect he's counted on it. After all, he's her brother." "Her own flesh and blood. But sometimes you owe more to strangers," Carrie said solemnly. Albert stared at her, and she laughed excitedly. "That was what she told me to tell Mr. Evans once she was dead, that she'd done what she'd done, made this will, that is, not to spite him, but because it seemed the right thing. And the right thing was to take care of Mr. Johnny and Hepzibah Green. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I just thought she was mad." Now she did understand. It seemed beautiful, even if sad. Although they'd quarrelled so bitterly, Mrs. Gotobed had loved Mr. Evans deep down in her heart, and the message she'd asked Carrie to give him would show him this plain. "Oh," Carrie said, "it'll make him so happy." "I wouldn't be too sure of that," Albert said. "But it will," Carrie cried. "Don't you see? He worried about her all the time. He was even jealous of Hepzibah because she was looking after her and he wasn't. So he'll be glad to know that she thought about him and wanted him to know it." The way Albert was staring at her, dry and disbelieving, with one eyebrow raised, was so maddening. "Of course you wouldn't understand," Carrie said. "You haven't got a brother or sister, so you just don't know, do you, how someone might feel? I know how I would, because I've got Nick. If we'd not spoken to each other for years and he died, it would make all the difference to have someone say he was still fond of me. I expect it'll make all the difference to poor Mr. Evans." She thought of him, of how he must feel now, mourning his dead sister, and wishing he had had some last word from her. And then how she would give him Mrs. Gotobed's message, to comfort him. She thought of a beautiful phrase, "to comfort his sad heart." And tears came into her eyes. "I expect he'll just weep for joy when I tell him." "Well, if you say so," Albert said doubtfully. though if I were you, I wouldn't be in too much of a hurry. But Carrie couldn't wait. Good news couldn't wait. She told him the first chance she had when they'd had tea and he was eating his lonely meal in the parlour. She said, "Mr. Evans, I've got something to tell you, something important," and then rushed straight into it before he could stop her and say, "Clear out while I'm eating." She told him what Mrs. Gotobed had asked her to tell him, her exact words, and then explained what she was sure they meant. Mr. Evans listened in bulging-eyed silence, and when he still didn't speak, even when she'd finished, she thought he hadn't taken it in. She said, "So you see, she did think of you and wanted you to know that she had. I didn't understand what she meant about sometimes you owe more to strangers, but I do now. She meant Hepzibah and Mr. Johnny, and how she owed it to them to let them stay in the house because there was nowhere else they could go. Not with Mr. Johnny's shy ways. And of course she knew you wouldn't mind. I mean, I expect she knew how you felt about the only things worth having being the things you'd worked for and earned for yourself, so you wouldn't want her to leave you the house. But she didn't want you to think she'd forgotten you or that she was just being spiteful or something." "I knew it," he said, his eyes bulged as if they were coming out of his head. "I knew it." "Of course you did," Carrie said kindly. "I suppose I'd know, really, if it was Nick and me. Even if we hadn't seen each other for ages and ages, I'd know he was still fond of me because I'm his sister. But it would be nice to be told that he was all the same, even if it did make me feel a bit sad." "Sad?" he repeated wonderingly. "Sad?" As if this was some peculiar new word he'd not heard before. "Well, a bit," Carrie said. "Only in a nice way, of course." He said nothing. The silence grew and grew. Carrie tried to think of some way to break it. When Mr. Evans finally stood up, his face wobbled in front of her. He said in a terrible voice, "Hepzibah, Hepzibah, Hepzibah. So she's got at you too, has she? Bewitched you with her lying tales and slippery ways as well as my poor sister." He pushed roughly past her and out of the room. He roared down the passage, "Louisa! Louisa!" He'd knocked over the water jug when he got up from the table. Carrie tried to mop up the mess with the edge of the tablecloth and put a mat under the worst of it to stop the damp mark in the table. But her hands seemed all thumbs, and she couldn't stop crying. It had all gone wrong somehow, and she didn't know why, but it had. Mr. Evans was angry, and he shouldn't have been. She tried so hard to explain. Nick said beside her, "What on earth have you done?" "It wasn't me," she sobbed. "It was him. He knocked the jug over." "I didn't mean that, you half-witted dope. Just listen to him. Did you start him off?" "He was shouting at Auntie Lou in the kitchen. Told you what was going on, didn't I? Told you she'd got her claws in, but you wouldn't have it. Miss Green this, Miss Green that, so kind to poor Dillis." "Oh, there's kind she's been. She knew what she was doing, that snake in the grass, that viper, and I dare say she thinks she's succeeded. Done me out of my rights and fixed up a snug home for herself and for the rest of her days. But I shan't let it lie. She needn't think it. Not if I have to drag her through every court in the land." Nick closed the parlour door. He whispered, half scared, half excited, "Whatever did you say to him, Carrie?" "Nothing wrong, I don't think. I don't know." She mopped her eyes with the tablecloth, but it was too wet to help much. "I just told him something Mrs. Gotobed asked me to tell him. I thought he'd be pleased. Perhaps he would have done it if I'd explained properly. But I did try."